On March 26, 2013, BioShock Infinite released on Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, and PC to overwhelming commercial and critical acclaim. It received over 70 gaming awards and accolades for its art design and narrative, and was promoted alongside The Last of Us as furthering the artistic medium of video games. However, having played the main game thrice over the years, I argue that BioShock Infinite is among the most overrated and disappointing games in recent memory, completely disregarding the rich legacy of its predecessors. Infinite fails to expand the gameplay scope and scale of the original BioShock, removing and diminishing the unique qualities of its predecessors until all that is left is a generic first-person shooter. With no real significance left in exploration or role-playing, the gameplay rests upon oversimplified shooting mechanics that long overstay their welcome. What remains of the game calls back to a heritage that Infinite can no longer call its own. Infinite instead rests on the strength of its cinematic atmosphere and its emotional narrative, the latter of which fails spectacularly. To fully understand BioShock Infinite on its critical failings and weaknesses, we first have to acknowledge the background and game design that went into the original BioShock. The developer Irrational Games began in 1999 with the release of System Shock 2, a sci-fi first-person shooter integrated with RPG elements. Despite its commercial failure, the game became highly influential for its complex game systems and engaging design philosophy. In 2007, Irrational Games, then called 2K Boston, developed BioShock, a new intellectual property made as the spiritual successor to System Shock 2. BioShock follows a silent player character who encounters the underwater city of Rapture, an objectivist utopia torn apart by genetic engineering and civil war. Along with their wide arsenal of weapons and ammo types, the player is given genetic powers that offer active or passive abilities and attributes. Within any given scenario, there are several means of interaction and play with the game and how to engage with enemies and the environment overall, like security devices and environmental hazards to name a few. All throughout, BioShock generally trusts the player to be the creator of their own experience, enabling the freedom and opportunities to play the game how they want. Unfortunately, BioShock Infinite discards most of these gameplay and narrative innovations in favor of a curated cinematic experience that negatively impairs the game's lasting effect overall. Set in 1912, BioShock Infinite follows Booker DeWitt, an embittered Pinkerton detective and former U.S. Army soldier, who is offered the chance to wipe away his gambling debts if he safely returns a young woman named Elizabeth. With help from the enigmatic Lutece twins, Booker is transported to the floating city of Columbia, an ultranationalist American theocracy governed by industrial capitalism and white supremacy. He finds Elizabeth, whom he discovers has extraordinary dimension-altering powers, and rescues her from her tower prison. As they resolve to escape the city, Booker and Elizabeth become embroiled in an ongoing civil war between Zachary Comstock, the militant prophet of Columbia and father of Elizabeth, and Daisy Fitzroy, the radicalized leader of the Vox Populi resistance movement. Similar to its predecessor, Infinite bases itself upon a politicized narrative and aesthetic, drawing from early 20th century American history on nationalism, religion, and racism, and yet is the least bit concerned with resolving or even properly addressing these thematic concerns. Daisy Fitzroy and the Vox Populi are portrayed as just as violent, oppressive, and irredeemable as their former masters are, proposing this moral equivalency between them and justifying the tremendous violence done to both of them by Booker and Elizabeth. It's these elements that begin to reveal just how cynical and misanthropic the story actually is, which will lead into the plot twist later on in the game. The gameplay was also drastically affected between games that make BioShock Infinite more generic and linear like other first-person shooters of its kind. Exploration and interaction in Infinite has been significantly de-emphasized compared to the original, structuring the game more like a roller coaster ride with set-piece moments and scripted sequences. Vigors are only doled out at specific story checkpoints, and gear has to be immediately equipped or else be lost for the rest of the game. The player is distrusted to be left alone to design their own profiles and discover their own combinations and strategies, instead being held by the wrist by the designers and how the player will play their game. At the end of the game, Elizabeth reveals that Booker is her father, and that she must kill him in order to destroy all the Bookers and Comstocks across the multiverse and stop the cycle of violence. The endgame twist ends up becoming a sort of false revelation that impressed players in the moment, but lose all stability upon closer reflection. The multiverse concept promotes the idea of limitless choice and possibility, not on immutable predetermination. This crucial misunderstanding and or ignorance of the multiverse concepts leads to a heap of logical fallacies and inconsistencies, which is not only absurd, but incredibly nihilistic and violent that offers nothing of value to players. However, I admit that where Infinite fails in its context and content, it absolutely succeeds in its presentation. The floating city of Columbia is beautifully realized and engaging with its mise-en-scène, color palette, light and shadow, and art design that makes every street, every building, every monument, and every vista spectacular to look at. This presentation also extends the overall direction, including the cinematics, voice acting, and motion capture performance of Infinite. Particularly, Troy Baker and Courtney Draper thrive in their roles as Booker and Elizabeth, respectively. The chemistry and interactions of Booker and Elizabeth are the emotional foundation of BioShock Infinite, upon which everything else in the game is built and supported by. While I intensely dislike the story and its themes, the storytelling techniques of the narrative itself is remarkably well produced for a high-budget AAA game. The subtle and creative use of foreshadowing, allusions, tropes, and metaphors in Infinite cyclically reflect upon its narrative and double back upon its big themes and ideas. Much like the 1995 film Fight Club, the revelation of the twist does not invalidate the rest of the experience, but instead serves to reinforce the concentration of Infinite's chief concerns on its characters, settings, and themes. Looking at the storytelling rather than the storytelling itself, it's this kind of creative and technical polish and expertise that makes it difficult for me to wholeheartedly condemn this game. In conclusion, BioShock Infinite is a game that is less than the sum of its parts. Ultimately, I find myself constantly going back to the meaning of BioShock Infinite. What does this artistic work offer that is relevant to the human beings who consume it? Does it seek to resolve the problems of jingoism, white supremacy, and capitalism in American society? Does it seek to deconstruct the linearity and freedom of video games that its predecessor once did? What lasting impact will BioShock Infinite ultimately have in how we create, play, and interpret the video game medium? At the end, I find only confused and self-contradicting narrative with mediocre shooting mechanics and an overall design philosophy that seems desperate to run away from the innovation and creativity that had once defined it.